Mahoraga has returned in the Jujutsu Kaisen sequel, and the battle for Earth has officially crossed into insanity. From the very first pages of this chapter, you can feel that something fundamental has shifted, not just in power scaling, but in tone, as if the story itself has accepted that whatever comes next will demand sacrifice on a scale we're not prepared for. Dorra finally reveals that his cursed technique is the fusion of light and mass itself, a power so alien that it violates the assumptions humans make about reality, while Yuka quietly executes a plan that may be even more terrifying, deliberately allowing Mahoraga the time it needs to adapt, while she disappears into the shadows, fully aware that every second she buys comes at the cost of her own life. And honestly, I don't know whether I should be celebrating or grieving, because buried beneath the spectacle is a truth that hurts far more than any ability reveal ever could. This chapter strongly implies that Megumi Fushiguro is dead, not missing, not sealed, dead. Technically speaking, two 10 Shadows users can exist at the same time, because unlike the 6 eyes, the technique doesn't follow a one-at-a-time rule. Kao already confirmed this in the original manga, meaning Mahoraga's presence here doesn't contradict anything we know, which leaves us with only one real conclusion: Megumi didn't make it. And the moment you accept that, a lot of things suddenly snap into place, especially Yuji's emotional state throughout the sequel. Back in chapter 13, Yuji admitted something that most readers brushed past. He was tired. Not physically, but emotionally. Tired of watching the people he cared about die. Tired of being the one left behind to bury them. And then later in chapter 266, he says something even more painful, that part of his dream was simply to live out the remainder of his life alongside Megumi, because without him, loneliness was unavoidable. Yuji wanted to die surrounded by his friends. That was the wish his grandfather planted inside him, the curse that shaped his entire worldview. But instead, that curse continues in the most twisted way possible by stripping those friends away one by one and forcing Yuji to keep living regardless. That context is what makes chapter 15 so devastating, because while the world prepares for another catastrophic clash of gods and monsters, the story quietly reminds us that Jujutsu Kaisen has never really been about strength alone. It has always been about loss, and about what it means to keep moving forward when loss becomes routine. The chapter opens with Yuka boarding a plane bound for Shinjuku, and the framing is deliberate. It's the same aircraft that once flew past Sugori during his fight with Maru, instantly tying this moment to the blood-soaked legacy of the strongest. Yuka knows she only has months left to live. The tumor in her brain has worsened to the point where even she can no longer lie to herself about it. She isn't flying toward victory or salvation. She's flying toward an ending she's already accepted. And yet, instead of fear or panic, what fills her mind is memory. She thinks about her life, about the moments she missed, about the person she became because of her illness, and inevitably, about her brother. Then she admits something quietly devastating. She never believed Suguri was a good older brother, but in her next life, she hopes she can be the older sibling instead. She imagines doing all the small, ordinary things she never got the chance to do. Holding back during fights so he could feel strong, letting him take snacks without arguing, helping him study, teaching him little tricks and shortcuts. Not power, not heroism, just a normal sibling relationship. And that's what truly breaks your heart, because Yuka doesn't dream of saving the world or being remembered as strong. She dreams of a life so ordinary, it almost feels cruel that she was denied it. As her condition worsens mid-flight, her vision blurs until the world dissolves into darkness. She loses awareness of where she is and who stands in front of her, and she mistakes Mino for Suguri. But Mino sees through it instantly. He understands that Yuka's "I'm fine" attitude has always been a performance, a mask she wears so others don't have to confront how bad things really are. Her illness has progressed too far. There's nothing left to pretend. All he can do is take her hand and apologize. And that single gesture unlocks a memory Yuka has spent years burying. Suguri was never a bad brother. He was protective to a fault. He endured pain silently. He sacrificed constantly. We see him bloodied, standing between Yuka and a curse that would have killed her, saving not just her, but her friend as well, never blaming her even once, taking every burden onto himself because he genuinely believed that was his role as the older sibling. This is where the chapter reaches true emotional peak, because for the first time, we're shown both sides of the sibling relationship that started this entire story back in chapter 1. Their arguments over Ra's ring, their constant bickering, their emotional distance, all of it was love that neither of them knew how to express properly. That realization connects directly back to chapter 14, where Suguri fights Maru and demands that the aliens leave Earth for many reasons, but the most important one is painfully simple. He just wants his sister to spend her remaining months in peace. To him, that is his duty. That is what a good big brother does. And while all of this emotional devastation unfolds, the story cuts away, reminding us that peace was never going to last. Elsewhere, Dorra encounters an old face, Ui, who greets him not as an enemy, but as a representative of Earth's sorcerers. Ui's appearance alone is jarring, his body twisted by age and experience, wide and hunched in a way that contrasts sharply with how other characters like Nobara have aged gracefully, clinging to the image they've always wanted to preserve. Ui explains his role without subtlety. Just like Mei broadcasts Gojo versus Sukuna to the entire world, this fight will be shown to everyone. The next generation of sorcerers needs to witness the pinnacle of violence humanity can reach. Modern sorcerers are weaker than ever, and Ui believes inspiration can only come from seeing what the strongest truly means. But Dorra isn't impressed. He states bluntly that he can't show anyone a good fight if his opponent dies in a single hit. He has never faced a sorcerer capable of surviving long enough to force him to go all out, and in that moment, the parallels to Gojo and Sukuna become impossible to ignore. Once again, we're confronted with the core tragedy of Jujutsu Kaisen, the loneliness of overwhelming strength. Gojo explained it best with his flower analogy. The strongest bloom at the top of the mountain, admired from afar, relied upon by everyone, but never truly understood. No one stands beside them. Sukuna reached the same conclusion from the opposite direction, rejecting love entirely, because to him, love only exists between equals, and once you surpass everyone, affection turns into dependence, and respect turns into fear. Yuji proved that belief wrong once, but now Dorra stands at the same crossroads, burdened by strength, isolated by expectation, and haunted by loss. And as the chapter edges closer to its climax, the stage is finally set for a confrontation that won't just decide the fate of Earth, but will test the very idea of whether love, connection, and understanding can exist at the highest levels of power at all. As the emotional weight of Yuka's memories fades into the background, the story pulls us back into the present, and the shift is brutal. The duel is no longer theoretical, it's happening now, in the same scarred battlefield where Sukuna once unleashed divine flame and Gojo erased reality itself with hollow purple, a place so damaged that even 70 years later, the land still hasn't healed. These scars aren't just environmental, they're symbolic. They represent the lingering consequences of the battle of the strongest, and for the current generation, Gojo's final stand is being mythologized in the same way Kenjaku once viewed the golden age of sorcerers during the Heian era. History is looping again, repeating the same cycle of relying on singular monsters to carry the weight of the world, and the question becomes whether this generation will break that pattern or be crushed beneath it. Ui openly acknowledges this when he explains why the fight must be broadcast, claiming that humanity has never truly witnessed the pinnacle of violence a human can reach, almost sounding unhinged as he implies that his own grandchildren need to see it, as if witnessing a living nuke is some kind of moral education. But this mentality fits perfectly within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, where strength has always been mistaken for salvation. Dorra listens to all of this with barely concealed indifference, because to him, violence isn't spectacle, it's function. He isn't interested in inspiring anyone. He wants a fight that makes him feel something. That's why when Yuka finally arrives in Shinjuku and launches herself from the plane without hesitation, the moment feels less like a heroic entrance and more like an execution she willingly walks into. as she falls through the sky, crying not out of fear, but out of grief, remembering Suguri's wish to be her younger sibling in another life. The aura surrounding her is overwhelming, not because it's flashy, but because it's final. She apologizes to Dorra before they even clash, acknowledging that what comes next will hurt both of them. And then she does the one thing everyone suspected was coming. She calls Mahoraga. This isn't just a summon, it's a declaration. Earlier, Suguri hinted that Yuka was planning to use a binding vow as a last resort, and now the pieces fall into place. The most likely exchange is brutal in its simplicity. Yuka sacrifices her remaining lifespan to strengthen Mahoraga, accelerating its adaptation and reducing the number of rotations its wheel requires to analyze Dorra's technique. In doing so, she drastically increases her chances of victory, but also signs her own death warrant. This Mahoraga is different, stronger, faster, more responsive, and unlike Megumi or Sukuna, Yuka hasn't even fully tamed it. Her interpretation of the 10 Shadows technique is fundamentally different, aligning with Sukuna's statement that sorcerers from different eras can wield the same technique in altered ways. Instead of purely commanding her Shikigami, Yuka adopts their properties onto herself, blurring the line between summoner and summoned. But Mahoraga remains untamed, which is why its first instinct is to kill her. The ritual activates the moment it's called forth, binding Yuka, Dorra, and Mahoraga to the battlefield until a victor is decided. She barely escapes into the shadows, buying time as the wheel begins its first rotation. Dorra doesn't waste a single second. For the first time, we see his cursed technique in full, and it's absolutely broken. His ability has no pronounceable name in human language, referred to only as a concept, light forced to behave as mass. Normally, light passes through matter, but Dorra collapses it, condensing photons into slabs of impossible density, its mass weaponized at the most fundamental level, explaining how he previously erased limbs without leaving so much as a wound behind. He drags these collapsing planes of light through Mahoraga's body repeatedly, each strike carrying the weight of planets and the inevitability of black holes. By all logic, this should have been a one-shot. Mahoraga has been destroyed before. Even a 15-finger Sukuna recognized that overwhelming force was the only reliable way to stop its adaptation. And yet, Mahoraga stands. For the first time in history, its wheel begins adapting to an extraterrestrial being. One rotation. Against Gojo's limitless and infinite void, it required 4 or 5. If Dorra allows that to happen here, the fight is over. And that's when the unthinkable happens. Dorra realizes he hasn't one-shotted someone, ever. This isn't just a physical confrontation anymore, it's a psychological one. For the first time, Dorra feels excitement instead of obligation. Mahoraga represents something he's never had, an opponent that can meet him, push him, force him to think instead of execute. But this enjoyment is exactly what makes the situation so dangerous, because surrounding this duel are political forces, religious laws, and cultural beliefs that threaten to tear everything apart. Back in earlier chapters, Maru referred to Shikigami as Kalan, and now we learn that the Lumarians use the same term for cursed spirits. In their belief system, beings like Mahoraga are considered sacred prey, entities bound by ancient law. If the Lumarians recognize Mahoraga as Kalan, they may attempt to stop the duel, and if they do, it will only deepen Dorra's resentment. Chapter 13 already foreshadowed his growing contempt for their ideology as he begins to question whether their rigid morality is responsible for every tragedy in his life. It was their beliefs that sparked the first conflict on their home planet. It was their laws that forced Dorra to kill his best friend. And now, on Earth, Cross dies indirectly because of them as well. Osiki even tells Dorra he wouldn't understand their pain because he's an outsider, isolating him further.
Ui openly states in this chapter that Dorra is lonely, and that loneliness mirrors Geto's fall down almost perfectly. If the Lumarians interfere now, disrespecting the Skute tradition of settling disputes through a one-on-one duel, it will be the final straw. Dorra has shown nothing but respect for their beliefs, but if they refuse to honor his faith in them will collapse completely. And when that happens, there's only one outcome left: the arrival of the one person capable of ending this without turning it into a massacre.
At this point, the fight between Dorra and Mahoraga stops being just a spectacle and becomes a ticking time bomb, because no matter how it ends, someone is going to cross a line they can't come back from. If Mahoraga completes its adaptation, Dorra loses for the first time in his life, and the myth of his invincibility shatters. If Dorra finds a way to erase Mahoraga completely, Yuka dies the moment the ritual ends, having traded her remaining lifespan for a chance that may not even save Earth in the long run. And if the Lumarians intervene, everything collapses into betrayal. The story has been building toward this exact fracture since the early chapters, quietly positioning Dorra at the edge of the same cliff that once claims Geto Suguru. Dorra has spent his entire life obeying laws he didn't write, killing in the name of principles he didn't choose, and losing everyone he loved because of a belief system that constantly reminded him he was an outsider. Chapter after chapter has shown his patience eroding, his respect turning into quiet resentment, and now, watching Mahoraga adapt before his eyes, he finally experiences something forbidden: enjoyment. For the first time, the fight isn't a duty or an execution, it's a challenge. That alone is dangerous, because the moment strength becomes personal, ideology becomes fragile. This is where the Lumarians' concept of Kalan becomes a problem. If they recognize Mahoraga as sacred prey and attempt to halt the duel, they won't just be interfering with a fight, they'll be denying Dorra the one thing he's never had: the right to choose his own path. The Skute tradition states clearly that disputes are settled through a champion's duel, and Dorra has honored that code without hesitation. If his own people break it now, after everything he sacrificed for them, his faith in their morality will collapse entirely. And when that happens, Dorra doesn't become a villain overnight. He becomes something far more dangerous: a man who no longer believes in the system that raised him. That's why Yuji Itadori's entrance isn't just likely, it's necessary. The Sorcerer Council already considers Yuji stronger than a death-binding vow-amped Mahoraga, which is insane when you really think about it, and yet they still hesitate, because Yuji represents something they can't control. He isn't motivated by duty, power, or ideology, he's motivated by people. There's no scenario where Yuji allows a 16-year-old like Yuka to shoulder the burden of humanity alone, especially when Gojo's dying wish was for the next generation to live, not die in place of others. Kusakabe told them the same thing, to go live their teenage years, because they'd already lost too much. Yuji stepping in isn't about proving strength, it's about ending the cycle. And what makes Yuji uniquely qualified isn't just his power, but his understanding of the soul. He sees the contours of the soul the same way Mahito once did, except, unlike Mahito, Yuji uses that knowledge to heal rather than distort. The idea that Yuji could save Yuka isn't far-fetched at all. If the soul is the body and the body is the soul, then healing the shape of the soul would naturally erase the tumor deforming her brain. Sukuna himself proved this principle when he survived what should have been certain death after being struck in the heart by the soul-splitting katana. If Sukuna could deny death through mastery of the soul, then Yuji, who understands the soul through empathy rather than domination, could do the same. That possibility alone reframes Yuka's sacrifice, transforming it from a tragic inevitability into a final test of whether this world is truly incapable of mercy. And that's where the thematic core of Jujutsu Kaisen resurfaces once again: the question of love at the highest levels of strength. Gojo lost Geto and became isolated. Yuji lost nearly everyone and kept moving anyway. Dorra lost Dorra, the one person who understood him as an equal, and that loss haunts him the same way Geto's absence haunted Gojo.
Ui openly acknowledges Dorra's loneliness, but recognition without understanding only deepens the wound. Sukuna believed love was worthless because strength erased equality, but Yuji disproved that belief through connection in battle, showing that cursed energy itself is rooted in emotion and that understanding can be forged in combat just as easily as destruction. Even Sukuna admitted that, in the midst of fighting, souls can connect. That's why the idea that Yuji, or even Yuka, could reach Dorra isn't naive. It's consistent with everything the story has established. Dorra doesn't need to be defeated, he needs to be understood. And that's what makes the battlefield itself so symbolic. This duel is happening on the same ground where Gojo and Sukuna tore reality apart, scars still visible decades later, reminding us that strength alone never heals anything. Kenjaku once looked at the Heian era and saw glory. Now the current generation looks at Gojo's final battle the same way. But history isn't meant to be repeated, it's meant to be confronted. And just like every generation before, this one has reached its breaking point, waiting for someone willing to challenge the assumption that sacrifice is the only answer.
No matter how this confrontation resolves on a surface level, the truth is that the duel between Dorra and Mahoraga was never meant to have a clean winner, because the real conflict has always existed beneath the clash of techniques, beneath adaptation and overwhelming force, in the quiet, crushing weight carried by those deemed strong enough to decide the fate of others. This is where Yuji Itadori's presence becomes unavoidable, not as a savior descending from the sky, but as a contradiction to everything this world believes about power. If Mahoraga falls, Yuka dies, and the message becomes clear once again that the young are meant to be fuel for the future. If Dorra is pushed too far and betrays the Lumarians, the cycle of alienation, resentment, and violence simply resets with a new name and a new face. And if the Lumarians interfere, attempting to impose their morality at the cost of Dorra's autonomy, they prove that even righteous belief can become tyranny when it refuses to listen. Yuji stands at the center of all these outcomes as the only character who has consistently rejected the idea that strength exists to dominate or to sacrifice others. From the very beginning, Yuji's philosophy has been painfully simple: people matter more than results. That belief is what made him Sukuna's perfect counter, and it's what positions him as Dorra's inevitable mirror. Dorra believes strength isolates because it removes equality, because once you stand above everyone else, connection becomes impossible. Yuji proves the opposite, that connection doesn't require equality of power, only equality of humanity. He doesn't need to overpower Dorra to reach him, he needs to fight him honestly, to meet him in the only language Dorra understands, and show him what Sukuna himself eventually acknowledged, that cursed energy, at its core, is emotion given form, and that battle can be a place of understanding rather than erasure. This is why Yuji's potential intervention reframes everything. His ability to perceive and interact with the soul isn't just a combat advantage, it's a narrative statement. If Yuji heals Yuka by restoring the shape of her soul, then sacrifice ceases to be the default answer. If he reaches Dorra through combat, then love is no longer something that chains the strong, but something that anchors them. The battlefield itself reinforces this message. The land still bears the scars of Gojo and Sukuna's final clash, decades later, a reminder that raw power leaves wounds that time alone cannot fix. Kenjaku once romanticized the Heian era, believing it represented the pinnacle of sorcery. Now, the modern generation romanticizes Gojo's death in the same way, mistaking destruction for transcendence. But cycles only end when someone refuses to play their assigned role, and Yuji has done that from the very beginning. He refused to become a weapon. He refused to abandon compassion.
He refused to let hatred define him, even when the world gave him every reason to break. That's why this arc doesn't exist to crown a new strongest or to introduce a bigger monster. It exists to ask whether this generation can finally learn from the failures of the last. Gojo failed because he stood alone. Geto fell because he felt unheard. Sukuna rejected love because he saw it as weakness. Dorra stands on the edge of that same path, and Yuji is the only one capable of showing him another way. Not through mercy without consequence, but through understanding earned in conflict. If Yuji succeeds, then the meaning of strength changes forever, from something that isolates to something that connects, from a burden carried alone to a responsibility shared. And if he fails, then the world will once again crown a monster and call it peace. That is what makes this moment so powerful, not the techniques, not the destruction, but the possibility that for the first time in Jujutsu Kaisen, someone might finally break the cycle, not by dying for others, but by choosing to live with them.